Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to tackle the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Ah, the Berlin
We've
Wall.
got a whole stack of sources to sort through, from firsthand accounts
Oh, for sure.
to scholarly analyses to
Mm-hmm.
BBC News reports from the time. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Our mission, if you will, is
Yeah.
to not just kind of rehash how the wall came down,
All
but
right.
really get into why it mattered, like why this event still resonates so much today.
I think that's important.
And trust me, we're going to uncover some surprises along the way. We're talking like bureaucratic blunders,
Mm-hmm.
the power of protest, and how sometimes people just kind of vote with their feet.
Interesting. It's interesting to think of the Berlin Wall as not just like a physical barrier,
Right.
but this like representation of the ideological divide that was like gripping the world for decades.
Totally. Okay, so before we get to the fall, we got to rewind a bit, right?
Mm.
Set the scene. So picture this.
Mm-hmm.
It's post-World War II,
Okay.
and Germany is literally split in two.
What?
East Germany under Soviet control, West Germany aligned with the Western powers.
Right.
And smack dab in the middle of it all
Yeah.
is Berlin, which was itself also divided. I was reading this BBC News piece, and man, the tension must have been unreal.
Yeah, I bet. You know, for millions of East Germans living under this regime they hadn't chosen,
Yeah.
West Berlin was like this beacon, you know,
Yeah.
of freedom, opportunity, all that. And that's why so many risked it all to flee west.
It's just wild to read about the lengths people went to. Like families were torn apart.
I can't imagine.
People died trying to cross that wall. One of our sources, I think it was the GOV Pub one, mentioned nearly 200 people died trying to escape to the West.
Wow, that many.
It really hits you, the human cost of this division.
Yeah. Those stories, they really drive home, like, how desperate people were for a different life.
Absolutely.
It's easy to forget, right? Like, for those living in East Germany, the wall wasn't just some political symbol. It was this concrete obstacle in their lives,
Yep.
Dictating their every move. And it wasn't just physical either. One of our sources mentioned this physics student in East Berlin
Oh, yeah.
who wanted socialism with a human face.
Yeah.
Like, he wanted the ideals, but with individual freedom, too.
Mm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It really highlights how, complex the feelings were for many East Germans, like disillusioned,
Yeah.
Yeah,
it makes you think, what does it really mean to be free?
Right.
Right? And I guess for so many, the desire for something better was so strong that they were, what's that phrase, voting with their feet,
Right.
choosing to just leave everything behind.
Absolutely.
And so in 1961, up goes the Berlin Wall. This kind of last-ditch effort by the East German government to stop the flow of people heading west.
It's a fascinating paradox, though, isn't it?
How so?
Well, the wall was supposed to make East Germany stronger, right?
Yeah.
But it ended up showcasing its weakness.
Mm-hmm.
It became this potent symbol of oppression, this reminder that they couldn't even hold on to their own people.
Right. And fast forward to the 1980s, and things are unraveling even further for the whole Soviet bloc.
Yeah.
I mean, the GUA Pub source was pretty clear about how much the Soviet Union was struggling. Economically, they were on the ropes.
Right.
They had Chernobyl, food shortages, the whole nine yards. It's like you can see how all this created the perfect conditions for change.
And that's where Gorbachev steps in with his glasnost and perestroika.
Oh, yes. For those who don't know, these were some pretty bold reforms.
Absolutely. Glasnost meant openness, more
Mhm.
transparency, freedom of speech, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And perestroika was all about restructuring the Soviet economy and their political system to be more efficient,
Right.
more responsive to the people.
It sounds like Gorbachev was trying to, thread a very fine needle.
Oh, for sure.
Loosen control just enough to fix things,
Right.
but not so much that the whole system collapses.
Exactly. And you could argue his efforts actually sped up the wall's fall.
Really? How so?
Well, that IWM article, remember?
Yeah.
It talked about how a lot of East Germans were escaping through other Soviet bloc countries.
Right, right.
And then when Hungary opened its border with Austria, it was like, boom, floodgates open.
Wow.
The crazy domino effect, right?
Yeah.
These regimes, built on control, they accidentally give their people the means to escape.
And it shows how interconnected everything was, right? What happened in one country had huge ripple effects on the others.
Absolutely. And we see this play out even more with the rise of movements like the Polish Solidarity Trade Union.
Yeah, the Berlin Wall 20 years later source went deep on that. Solidarity was huge, proof that peaceful, organized resistance could actually work.
What's so striking about Solidarity is how they evolved, right?
Mm-hmm.
From a trade union fighting for workers' rights to this powerful political force demanding bigger change.
And their roundtable discussions where the Communist Party had to, like, sit down with Solidarity and negotiate,
Yeah,
that was a real turning point.
definitely. It felt like the power balance was shifting right in front of everyone's eyes.
It must have been an incredible time in Eastern Europe. You had Hungary taking down their border fences, Baltic states forming these human chains in protest,
Yeah.
Czechs taking to the streets demanding democracy. It's inspiring to see how one act of defiance can lead to another and another and another.
Absolutely. And it all culminates in what many see as the turning point in East Germany, the Leipzig protests.
Ah, the Leipzig protests. Can you imagine the guts it took for 70,000 people to march, knowing the risks,
Very right.
demanding democracy in the face of potentially a very violent crackdown?
And that GOV pub source mentioned something chilling.
What's that?
Hospitals were prepped for casualties. They fully expected to use force.
Wow.
But the protesters held their ground. Their peaceful demonstration set the stage for everything that was to come.
So how do we get from these massive protests to the wall actually coming down? This is where things get really interesting. It all comes down to one now infamous press conference,
Ah, yes.
Günter Schabowski.
He was the East German official, tasked with announcing these new travel regulations they were trying out.
Yeah.
Supposed to be like slightly relaxed rules, nothing major.
Yeah.
But man, that press conference, it was a total disaster. The BBC News and Time articles both covered it.
It's almost funny, right? Like thinking about how this seemingly minor event had such huge consequences.
Absolutely. So picture this. Schabowski up there at the podium, kind of fumbling through his notes.
Uh-oh.
And some reporter, just doing their job,
Mm-hmm.
asks a clarifying question about when these new rules take effect.
Okay.
And Schabowski, without missing a beat, says, immediately.
Oh, wow.
Just like that, the border was open.
So what happened next? People just like started showing up at the wall.
Pretty much. West German TV, which a lot of East Germans could actually watch, broadcast the whole press conference live.
Wow.
People saw it, heard Schabowski say immediately, and they just started heading for the wall.
It's crazy how one miscommunication can change the course of history.
It really is.
Yeah.
I think it shows just how much that pent-up desire for freedom was simmering in East Germany.
Yeah.
People were ready to grab onto any opportunity, even one born from a bureaucratic slip-up.
Right, and that brings us to another incredible story, that of Harold Jaeger. He was the border guard commander at Bornholmerstrasse.
Ah, yes, Harold Jaeger.
The Time article painted this picture of him, caught in the middle of all this chaos, facing this growing crowd at the border crossing, but with no clear orders from above.
Talk about a tough spot.
Right. This guy devoted 25 years of his life to the East German regime, and then at this crucial moment, they just leave him hanging. The article mentioned how insulted he felt by that.
Yeah, like abandoned after all that service.
That makes you think, you know?
About loyalty, duty, what we owe to those in power, I guess.
Totally. But in the end, Jaeger chose compassion over violence.
That's right.
Instead of holding the line, he opened the gates, prevented what could have been a very bloody confrontation.
And ushered in this incredible moment of celebration, people drinking champagne, chipping away at the wall with whatever they could find. Those images of crowds flooding through the Brandenburg Gate,
Yeah.
they're just iconic.
So the wall comes down, this euphoric moment, but obviously the story doesn't end there. Just a year later, Germany was officially reunified.
Right.
What a process that must have been. Two countries, divided for decades, now trying to merge into one.
It was a massive undertaking. You had these huge economic disparities between East and West Germany.
Yeah, the East German economy was, well, it wasn't exactly thriving under communist rule.
Definitely not. It needed a complete overhaul to even begin to catch up with the West.
And then there were the social and political hurdles too, right? Like merging two different political systems, two sets of laws.
Oh, absolutely. Integrating those wasn't easy.
It's a good reminder that tearing down a wall is one thing, that symbolic act.
Right.
But the real work, the building of a unified future, that's often much harder, much messier.
It's in the details for sure.
And of course, the impact of the wall's fall went way beyond Germany. I mean, it basically triggered the collapse of the entire Soviet bloc.
Absolutely. Like a chain reaction across Eastern Europe. By the end of 1990, most of the physical wall was gone.
Wow.
And within a year, the Soviet Union itself dissolved.
Wow.
The IWM source put it pretty bluntly.
What was that?
The Soviet system just couldn't adapt. It crumbled.
The Cold War, which had defined global politics for 40 years, was over. It's almost hard to comprehend.
I know, right?
I
Such a
know.
mix of triumph and uncertainty. Freedom and democracy had won, but then you had this power vacuum.
Yeah.
New challenges, new conflicts were bound to emerge. It's like that end of history idea we talked about before.
Fukuyama's theory?
Right. This notion that with the triumph of liberal democracy, we'd reach the final form of government.
The history rarely plays out so neatly, does it?
Definitely not. Looking back, it's clear Fukuyama was a bit too optimistic. We've seen the rise of illiberal democracy,
Yeah.
the resurgence of authoritarianism,
Yeah.
all sorts of new conflicts.
The world today is, well, it's complicated, more interconnected, more complex than ever before. And I gotta say, one of the things that really struck me, especially from that Chatham House piece,
Yeah.
is how since the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's been this global surge in wall building.
It is a bit ironic, isn't it?
It's like we tear down this one iconic wall and countless others pop up in its place.
The Chatham House expert called it a sovereign act.
Meaning,
Well, countries are facing all these anxieties, right? Migration, globalization, security, all that.
yeah,
And they respond by reasserting their borders, both literally with walls and metaphorically with policies.
it's all about creating the sense of us versus them, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those divisions aren't just physical. We see them with like virtual walls too.
Well, like internet censorship.
Yeah, censorship, trade barriers, controlling information.
All designed to restrict freedom, limit the flow of ideas and people. It's like the more things change, the more they stay the same, you know?
It's a recurring theme throughout history, that's for sure.
Mhm. You know, it's amazing how the fall of the Berlin Wall, it still sparks all this debate and discussion, even, decades later.
Yeah.
It's like we're still trying to figure out what it all meant, trying to make sense of the world it created.
I think you're right. The fall of the Berlin Wall, it wasn't just about the end of the Cold War
Right.
or even German reunification. It was this like deeply symbolic event. It captured that human desire for freedom,
Yeah.
And it showed just how fragile those systems built on like division and control really are.
It's like the act of tearing down that wall brick by brick, it was a rejection of this idea that we have to be separated.
Exactly. By ideology, geography, anything.
And it proved that even barriers that seem impossible to overcome, well, they can be overcome.
It speaks to like the resilience of the human spirit, doesn't it?
It does.
Our ability to hope, to resist, to change the world around us.
But then, as we've been talking about, all these new walls have emerged since then.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly struggling with this urge to build and tear down, right? To connect and divide.
This kind of push and pull.
Yeah, there's a duality there, right?
Mm.
In the human experience. We crave connection, but also distinction. Belonging, but also individuality.
So the challenge is finding that balance.
I think so.
A way to embrace what we share as humans, but also respect our differences.
Exactly.
It makes me think that, the legacy of the Berlin Wall, it's not just about celebrating tearing down that one physical barrier.
Right.
It's also about recognizing all the walls we still build.
In our minds, in our societies.
Even in our hearts sometimes.
It's an ongoing process, isn't it? To question, to challenge those walls, to try and build bridges instead.
Yeah. The Berlin Wall reminds us that change is possible even when it seems impossible.
Absolutely.
It teaches us to never take our freedoms for granted.
And to stand up for what we believe in no matter what.
What do you think is the most, enduring legacy of the fall of the Berlin Wall?
That's a good question. I think for me, it's that reminder that history is never really over.
Oh, I like that.
The choices we make today, the walls we build or tear down, they'll shape the world for future generations.
It's like we all have a role to play in creating a future where those barriers, those divisions, no longer hold us back.
Exactly.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the fall of the Berlin Wall.
It's been great chatting with you.
Always a pleasure. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. We hope you found this exploration insightful, maybe even inspiring.
We encourage you to check out the sources we mentioned. Keep exploring this event.
There's always more to learn, more to discover. Until next time, keep diving deep.